Welcome everyone to our webinar, The Fundamentals of Transformation in Human Services. Today, we're going to take just a couple of minutes to introduce you to our organizations, the National Leadership Consortium and the Council on Quality and Leadership. Then we'll look at the importance of transformation, both within our field, within our organizations, and as leaders, and look at how this transformation has evolved in our history in our field. Then we'll take a look at some pitfalls quickly that leaders and organizations often fall into as they undertake transformation. But we'll end with some strategies of how you can overcome those pitfalls, some ways that you can successfully build a strategy for transformation, and give you some things to think about as you're beginning this journey. So the National Leadership Consortium was founded in 2006, and the consortium was founded to assure that the next generation of disability service sector leaders have the skills, knowledge, and resources needed to lead organizations and systems that are responsive to people with disabilities and their families. When it was founded, it was the first organization and the first national leadership development program specifically dedicated to leadership in our field and that program for disability service sector professionals. Today, we continue that mission, but we also offer programs, trainings, research, evaluation, and technical assistance focused on 5 key areas. And those 5 areas are best practices in services and supports, current and future trends impacting services and supports, individual leadership, interpersonal leadership, and systems and organizational best practice and change management. Through those focus areas, supporting transformation is our primary work and primary focus of the consortium.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mary Kay Rizzolo from CQL. Disclosure, Kate Dunbar is also joining us today because I'm isolated down in my basement with COVID. And so if I start coughing or get brain fog, she's gonna jump in. So thank you, Kate. So for those of you who aren't familiar with CQL, we've been around for over 50 years, and we actually began as a national planning committee, and we were founded by other disability organizations, including both AAIDD and the ARC of the US. And when we began, our focus was really on improving conditions in state institutions. And remember, this is back in like the late 60s and early 70s. And since that time, we've evolved or transformed. And now our focus is really on community-based, personally defined services. So we work with human service organizations and systems to define, measure, and improve both quality of life for people receiving services and quality of services for provider organizations and systems. We've got 5 core services that we offer, including accreditation, training, certification, research, and consultation services. And we work with organizations across the US, many in Canada, as well as in Ireland and New Zealand. So we're really happy to join the National Leadership Consortium today. Okay. That's me too. So this is a quote from Leslie Long at one of our partner organizations. And the reason I like this quote is twofold. The first is that the process of transformation, I think, is never ending. I think that our field is constantly evolving and there's always ways that we can improve. And I also like the notion of the mutual understanding, and we'll talk a little bit later, but I think that when you're going through transformation, you need to really make sure that your staff understand kind of the why behind what you're doing, and that they understand that it's a collaborative effort for a mutual or a common goal. Next slide.
As leaders in our field, our charge is to be responsive to people with disabilities, including, as this quote from Patrick Maynard from I Am Boundless shared, responsive to people's demands, needs, and dreams. And so that charge causes our organizations to be ever evolving, like Mary Kay said, and ever changing in a lot of ways, because We've gotten better and more intentional about listening to people with disabilities as authorities in their lives. So as we learn, our understanding of our purpose also evolves. You can go to the next slide. The way that we ensure that evolution is, or that this evolution that we keep talking about is intentional, is by leading transformation. So focusing on transformation holds us and holds our organizations accountable to what we've learned, as we determine what changes in how we operate and how we provide supports are needed. Transformation causes us to take an honest look at where we are and where we need to go. And it ensures that we take action, and when we can be, helps us to be proactive. Focusing on transformation also builds trust with our stakeholders. Transformation shows that we're committed to learning and adapting in ways that meet our stakeholders' needs as they're also changing. So now we'd love to hear from you, and you can post this in the Q&A. What has hindered, or in your experiences, what has hindered your organization's transformation? We'll give you a second to start posting those. Some things, I see some responses coming in. Great, we see some commonalities coming in the chat. We really appreciate you sharing these barriers that your organizations are facing. And it looks like a lot of these barriers will be touched on throughout the presentation. So we'll do our best to touch on these or to talk about these. And then also, as you're listening to some of the fundamentals and some of the strategies and practices that we're sharing, if there are ideas or further questions that you have, please feel free to put those in the chat, or please feel free to follow up with us afterwards. Go to the next slide. So we've made the point that transformation has been a constant in our field. And when we think back throughout our history, we see examples of services that we thought were best practice at the time that they were being provided, that now we know and now that we know much better, we strive to transform our organizations to do better. Mary Kay shared a great example of what we used to do and what we know and how we've transformed our services. Another example is that we used to call our services quality when they met people's basic needs for survival. But now that we know that great services support people to have meaningful and included lives in their communities and support people to direct their lives, now that we know that, that knowledge informs our transformation, and it has informed our transformation throughout history, in legislation, in advocacy, in our services that we provide, and in so many ways. So looking throughout history, we also know that transformation has required the dedication of leaders who have the skills and that are needed to transform their services and systems. We've relied on those leaders, and we continue to rely on those leaders to transform our services and practices, because we also know that we still have a long way to go. Go to the next slide.
As our field, our organizations, and us as leaders go through transformation, there are often some pitfalls that we can fall into that we're going to go over today, and then we're going to talk about some strategies and ways to avoid those. The first two pitfalls that we'll look at or consider is losing focus on the customer and neglecting the people dimension of change. As organizations go through transformations, that often the first thing that's examined are the structural changes that will be involved in this transformation. Although those are important aspects of transformation and change, this often comes at the neglect of looking at the people involved in this transformation. That's the staff working in the organization, the families connected with it, those who choose your services and supports, and others who will be impacted by this transformation. By focusing on both the behavioral changes and aspects of transformation and the structural aspects of transformation, your organization is more likely to be successful and less likely to fall into this pitfall. Another area that organizations often struggle with is not managing expectations of what's called the trough of despair, or chaos stage in change theory. When your organization or your team goes through a transformation, there's always a period where things are chaotic, where as this is called, the trough of despair hits. And this is after the initial catalyst for change. After you start working through this change, things seem like they're going downhill, or that things are chaotic. People are a little unsure that this is the way that organization should be moving, or that your team should be moving. And this is a typical thing that happens in times of transformation. But often leaders, organizations don't manage that and don't share that this will happen. And so people are unsure when they get to that chaotic stage, and oftentimes then want to turn back and away from the transformation. And so that's a pitfall that organizations often come to. Another area that organizations don't pay enough attention to often in transformation is not pausing for celebration and reflection. It's often focused on areas of the structures, what's happening, how are we doing with our services, with our structural changes, and not taking time to pause for celebration and reflection. Also, organizations are not always as attuned to the ways that they are measuring their changes and considering how shifting their organizational focus or transforming their organization can impact the outcomes that they're looking at. And so organizations may stick with what's called old world measures, or the way that they used to measure success, even though they're looking for new outcomes and new ways of doing things. And the last 2 points, or the last 2 pitfalls that organizations and leaders often fall into, are very tied to each other. And that's over-reliance on a centralized change management system, or a centralized change management group, and focus on pushing change instead of generating pull. Oftentimes, organizations have a group of stakeholders or a group of leaders who are going to be the ones focusing on the transformation, leading that effort. And that's great, but having an over-reliance on that group often can lead to issues in this transformation. And that has to do with that last point, because the change is pushed out instead of people coming to the change and coming to the ideas themselves and wanting to be involved in it. It's often pushed from, again, that one group of leaders or a centralized change management system out, instead of having people come together around a new vision, a new goal, new outcomes. So to overcome some of these pitfalls, we're going to talk about a few strategies that you can use when your organization or your teams are looking to transform.
And for those of you that didn't see in the chat, just to summarize some of the input that we got from what has hindered transformation in your organization, we're seeing a lot around the staffing issues, including turnover and buy-in. COVID came up a bunch, and a commitment to the status quo, so maybe kind of a fear of change. So we're going to talk a little bit about these 5 different strategies around transformation, and obviously each one of them alone could be an entire webinar, so we're just going to kind of hit some highlights, but here we go. Okay, so open communication. One of the first strategies is open communication, and it may kind of seem like common sense, and many people that we talk to, they feel like they already do this, but we really do find that there's a lot of room for improvement in this area. And one of the most critical kind of parts of open communication is transparency. And sometimes, you know, you say, oh, you should be more transparent, and maybe it sounds a little idealistic. And especially if you were maybe trained in kind of the need to know model. But there's just a lot of benefits from transparency. And the research shows that being a transparent organization can increase trust in your staff. It can improve morale. It can lower stress, and it can lead to better employee performance. So there needs to be open communication between your leadership and between your staff on the ground. And there needs to be a culture that embraces kind of the supportive feedback. By not being punitive, by being supportive, this can help with building that trust. And then on the slide, I mentioned not being a dream snuffer. And we typically use this when we talk about when you're supporting somebody to achieve their goals. And warning you to not respond to a goal negatively if you think it's unrealistic, but to really listen. Like Caitlin said, just listening is so important to figure out what it is about that goal that's so important to the person, and what can you do to support them to move in that direction. But I think it works here in terms of organizations as well. And I think that when we're talking about DSP issues and buy-in, we need to really truly listen to our DSPs and our frontline supervisors, and then we need to respond to that information or close that gap. So, just like we tell you not to snuff people's dreams, don't ignore or dismiss your staff suggestions and their ideas, because truly, it sounds idealistic and simplistic, but everybody does have something important to share and contribute. And the key is responding. At CQL, we have a saying that we use a lot, and we say, no action without data and no data without action. So if you're getting this information from your staff, and if they're trusting you enough to kind of share their thoughts with you, then you need to respond or act in some way. And the last point I want to make is that your staff need to understand the why. Why are you doing things? So why are you collecting certain pieces of data, for example? And it isn't to catch people doing something wrong or to make more work for people. There really is a reason behind it. So are you communicating that with them? And then do they understand why you're instituting different policies? That maybe you have requirements from the state or the feds, and are they involved in decisions around your policies and practices? So again, that transparency can help build trust, kind of get everybody on the same page, and hopefully foster a better work environment. Okay, next slide. Another part of open communication is making sure that you include all the key stakeholders. So the DSPs, the people that you're supporting, everyone. And last year we interviewed Tia Nellis, and she's a board member of CQL, and she's also the past president of SABE, and I'm sure many of you probably know Tia. And we also interviewed Chester Finn, who's also on our board and also is a past president of SABE. But we asked them how to meaningfully include people who receive services in organizations, whether that's in a committee or a board or some role. And since these organizations are really making really critical decisions in their life, they need to be at the table. And there's that saying, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And I think that's true. So this is just a quote that talks about just how important it is that people have truly meaningful roles. Next slide. So Tia shared some tips on how to meaningfully engage people receiving services. And in this case, she was specifically talking about them being on committees. And so some of the recommendations that she had included having mentors to support the person receiving services, doing trial runs on a committee to make sure that it was a good fit. And we don't hear about this happening a lot. And then having the person receiving services choose their own support. So whether that's who supports them in the meeting or what type of support that they have. We'll go to the next slide. And then Chester Finn also gave us some great recommendations. And interestingly, they were different from Tia's, but they complemented her recommendations. And one of them was to make sure that you rotate committee members. And I'm sure that you guys see this, we see it all the time. So there's an organization, and maybe you've got one or two really good self-advocates, but then that person or those few people end up being on every committee or every board anytime that you need some perspective from people receiving services. And the organization may feel that, that everyone receiving services is represented by this one person. And so that's a pitfall that we want to be careful about. But probably my favorite recommendation from Chester was to choose people who are going to hold you accountable. And he challenged organizations to select people who, he said, quote, will challenge things. So people that are going to ask those hard questions. And there's more information on our website if you're interested in this. It's just kind of some practical tips on meaningfully including people who receive supports in your organization. And so next slide. And another group that you are going to want to include, and this ties into all the discussion on chat, is your DSPs. And some promising practices that we've seen from organizations that we partner with include having DSPs get together and meeting without management present to kind of help guide the agency's policies and procedures. So giving them, kind of empowering them to have those meetings. Another suggestion was anonymous feedback mechanisms, so that staff could give feedback to the organization, but they wouldn't feel like there was going to be any retaliation or retribution. And we found in organizations too that after they start building up that trust and improving the culture, then staff were more likely to actually include their names on the feedback, that it became less of an anonymous thing and more of a dialogue between leadership and the DSPs. And once you get that data, remember, no data without action. You need to follow up on what you learn, or at least let them know that you've heard their comments so that they know that they're being heard and that their efforts weren't in vain. Another thing that we've seen some pretty good success with are mentorship programs where DSPs are actually paired up with a member of the leadership team. So anything that you can do to really meaningfully include DSPs and frontline supervisors in how your organization functions. So from onboarding and training to policies and strategic planning. So I am going to do a little poll here. All right, so do your DSPs do these things, or are these systems in place at your organization? This is great. They're really rolling in, so I'm going to give it some more time here. Okay. They're still coming in, sorry. All right, I'm going to go ahead and post the results here. So it looks like 3/4 of you do have a system in place to provide anonymous feedback. So I would just encourage you to maybe somehow convey that you're hearing that feedback and that you're taking it into consideration so that they know that you're acting upon it and kind of closing that loop. It looks like the one that is least prevalent is making space for DSPs to meet without leadership to help guide policy. So that might be something to consider, whether that's a focus group or whether, you know, they have little lunch meetings or something, but just giving them the space and empowering them to have those discussions. Okay, so thank you for sharing that. All right.
One area that open communication greatly impacts is your organization's culture. And so as we're thinking about transformation, an area that is key in that is understanding your organization's culture and having a move towards a more positive culture in your organization. So as we look at culture and consider some ways to shape that, I wanted to start first with these 3 key points. So culture is not static. Culture continuously grows and evolves, but in doing so, it needs intentional nurturing. You may have worked in organizations where your organizational culture was negatively or positively impacted your organizational outcomes. When you're looking at transformation, you want your organizational culture to be aligned with your organizational transformation, with those goals, because it can be a key area or a key example of how your transformation will succeed or will not, depending again on where that culture is or how that culture is. In culture and in shaping culture, and especially in positive culture change or a move towards a more positive culture, leadership is key. There is an abundance of evidence that shows that great leadership is critical to sustained positive culture transformation, and that leaders who build great working environments, those who instill trust, who communicate effectively, who connect their employees to a purpose and to the organization's purpose, and those leaders who are consistent with their behaviors help to create a positive cultural transformation. We all know how important leaders can be in shaping an organizational culture, but also in how important they are in shaping an employee's experience within that organization and within that culture. And culture impacts organizational success. There is a lot of research that shows that a healthy culture has been linked to increased employee satisfaction and happiness, and therefore increased employee engagement. This increased employee engagement, satisfaction, and happiness lead to increased morale, lower turnover, improved productivity, and more, all of which have a positive impact on services and supports offered by organizations. As you're moving through an organizational transformation, it's important to keep this quote by Peter Drucker, author and consultant, in mind, that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So not to say that strategy is not important, but not recognizing or putting culture at the forefront during your time of transformation is a mistake and can lead you to fall into some of those pitfalls that we talked about before. Unilever is a great example of this change. So a large company, Unilever, who all of you probably know, was examining why their sales were down one year, and they recognized this had been a trend over a number of years. So they examined some of the strategic ways that they can make changes to their services, changes to the types of products that they provide to increase their sales, but they also decided to take a look at their culture. And so they looked not only at those strategic goals, but also at some cultural goals that they can change, or things that they can change within their organization. By meaningfully involving employees in dialogue, in planning, engaging and sharing and listening with those employees, Unilever's culture shifted. As it shifted in combination with those strategic goals and strategic plans, they saw an increase in revenue, a decrease in the organizational dysfunction within their teams and within the organization. And they were working towards shared vision more cohesively with increased employee happiness. So the success of this transformation, of their transformation, was not only the result of the strategic plans and those strategic goals, but also because they engaged in a culture shift and recognized the importance of that. As your organization is looking to undergo transformation and you want to consider your culture, here are some ways that you can work towards a culture change or work to better connect your culture with your new transformational goals. First, you have to start with understanding your current culture. So you can do this in a number of ways, but you can talk with employees, you can better understand how your culture shapes the products and the services that your organization is currently providing. You can do interviews, again, listening to employees and engaging them in this exploration stage will help you later on, because engaging employees throughout this process is key. When you want to work towards culture change, involving your leadership is also important. As we talked about before, leadership is key in shaping employees' experiences within the organization. And so you need to involve leadership in this shift or in the ideas towards a new culture. Where you can tie your culture to your vision, mission, and goals is after you involve that leadership. So your culture should be a reflection of your vision, mission, and goals. It helps you to not only better provide or better meet that goal and that mission of your organization, but it also helps to connect your employees to a purpose. Having a culture within your organization that is tied to those vision, mission, and goals helps employees, new hires, family members, those who use your services and supports to better see the purpose of your organization throughout every level and throughout all different teams. Just as it's important to engage employees as you're working to understand your current culture, it's also important to engage employees as you're working towards a new culture. Like the Unilever example, it's important to incorporate them in discussions, listen to them about their experiences and their ideas, and incorporate them in planning towards a new culture. As you're working towards shifting and as your culture is shifting, it will be important to let the goals for your culture guide future decisions. One key example of this is as you are hiring. So it's important to consider your culture and what you want your culture to be as you make organizational decisions. This could be around the kinds of projects that you engage in, the kinds of services and supports that you continue to provide, but understanding your culture and how well it will mix with or how well it will support or hinder your goals is important. As I said, one example of this would be when you're making hiring decisions. Recognizing your culture and understanding it can help you in hiring employees that will add to that culture and that will help to have that culture flourish and evolve in a positive way. As you're moving towards culture change, just like within any organizational transformation, tracking your progress is important and being patient. Like organizational transformation, personal transformation, professional transformation, it takes time. So it's important to be patient and to continue to track your progress towards that. And it really helps to keep the strengths and the positives that are occurring during this time in the forefront.
So that leads nicely to the strengths-based approach discussion. And so what do we mean when we're talking about a strengths-based approach? At CQL, we kind of embrace a specific approach called appreciative inquiry. And some of you have probably heard of this, but I'll just kind of discuss it briefly. So this concept was developed back in around 1980, and there was a grad student who was looking at how operations were working at the Cleveland Clinic. And the Cleveland Clinic had just purchased a hotel across the street. It was called the Omni Hotel. And it was a place for families of patients that were being seen at the Cleveland Clinic. But they were having all sorts of trouble with this hotel. So they brought in this grad student who basically, it was almost an experiment, was charged with kind of turning the organizational culture around. So he went into this hotel, and what he wound up doing was sending all of the management, all of the staff from the Omni Hotel to a five-star hotel in Chicago. And their assignment was to write down everything that went well. So everything that they enjoyed that week. What did the hotel do well? And they weren't supposed to comment on anything negative. It was all positive. And then at the end of the week, they compiled all of this feedback into a report and they gave it to the five-star hotel management. Well, the management was so appreciative that they actually threw a party. They threw a banquet for the Omni Hotel staff. And then the Omni Hotel staff, they were so energized when they went back to their hotel. They had all these ideas, morale improved. They started kind of experimenting with things to see if they would work. And the hotel wound up becoming a 4-star hotel. And so I kind of explained that because in a nutshell, that's kind of what we're trying to do with human service organizations, that we want to focus on what's going well, and then we want to apply it, what's going well, to other areas that possibly could be improved upon. So there's a shift from what is to what could be, kind of the dreaming stage. So, you know, what does this look like in terms of an organization? It might be something just shifting from asking questions like, you know, what can we do to reduce the number of quote unquote behavioral issues that Mary Kay is having? Well, maybe we turn that to, remember last summer, Mary Kay had a really great summer. What was it about that summer? What was it about the supports we provided that worked for her? And what can we learn from that? And we just made a video about this, and it's on our website, a little 5-minute video that you might enjoy or you might be able to incorporate into your training. But this whole concept of appreciative inquiry, it's really important in terms of human services, because traditionally we've been really heavily rooted in more compliance-based models. And this is especially true for accreditation bodies like CQL, where when we first start working with organizations, you can tell that they're suspicious, like they think that we want to come in and catch them doing something wrong, but that couldn't be further from the truth. We want to go in and find out what they're doing well, and we want to learn from that and replicate that and celebrate that. So the takeaway is just don't give more attention to what is going wrong than to what is going well. And so we challenge you to be what we call a strengths spotter. Next slide. So these are just some steps that you could take to move in this direction. And I challenge you again to do this, maybe start fresh tomorrow. But for every negative, see if you can come up with 5 positives. And this has also been embraced. You're hearing a lot about this during COVID with all of the wellness literature and research about gratitude and about, before you go to sleep, think of 3 or 5 things that you're grateful for. And it can really change your focus and shift it from a negative one to a positive one. And I think we're all struggling to remain positive these days. So these are just some ways to kind of help you focus on being more positive. And it ties back to that, positive psychology research. And we know from that research that people who know their strengths and who they actually use their strengths more frequently, they've been found to feel happier, they've got better self-esteem, they're more likely to accomplish their goals. So if it works for people, then obviously the same concepts or notions should apply for organizations. But again, just like in the positive psychology literature, people have a hard time identifying their own strengths. And in fact, if you point out a strength to them, they may not recognize it as one. They may think it's not that special. Everybody does that. So this really has to be a conscious effort to really do some deep soul searching to find out what are our strengths and then what can we learn from them. And we work with hundreds of organizations. I mean, I can honestly say that at every organization, there's something that works. Maybe not a complete pocket of excellence, but there's something that works, something that we can learn from. And the challenge just may be identifying that and then celebrating it. But we need to make this shift. We need to make this transformation where we move from a more critical or rigid environment to one that's really embracing creativity and experimentation. And we hear a lot about things like, promoting dignity of risk. I think we need to do that for our staff too, that we need to really just let them know that it's okay to fail, that failing is just an opportunity to learn, to reassess, and to adjust. That's that. Next slide. And this is just a quote from our partners at Ray Graham, and they just embraced the notion of appreciative inquiry, and it helped them to really identify what they were doing well so that they could share that information with others. And then it helped them to identify areas that they might want to try and improve upon. Next slide.
Wonderful. So before we jump into talk about our next topic, we wanted to ask you to respond to 2 questions. So hopefully a poll will pop up for you. And it asks you to answer the question, do you think that strategic planning is an essential practice for organizations in our field? Now, we're asking you this, it might feel a little bit basic, but bear with us. If you answer this question, and then we'll ask you to answer one more.
They're still rolling in, but
Yeah,
it's
lots of
pretty
responses
clear
rolling
what
in.
the,
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, there's a clear,
there's a clear trend here.
towards yes, trend towards yes. We do
Okay, should I
feel-
just end it?
Yeah, thanks. Wonderful. So 94%, we'll say 94% of you that had the opportunity to respond said yes. And then we're going to ask you a second question, if you can respond to this one too, is do you feel do you feel like there is not enough time to commit to meaningful strategic planning in your organization? So that not enough time is kind of essential to the way we're asking this question. So we've got a lot of responses rolling in. Thanks, everyone.
I'm just going to share the results.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got,
Sorry if I cut anybody off.
no, that's okay. So we've got about 68% of you sharing that there's not enough time. So again, 94% of you said that yes, strategic planning is an essential practice for organizations in our field, and 68% of you that had the opportunity to respond said, but nope, there's not enough time to be able or to actually engage in strategic planning. If we go to the next slide. Awesome. So your experiences really align with, and actually, I think you fared a lot better than the results from this Harvard Business School study, where they surveyed 10,000 top leaders in their organizations. And what they found is that 97% of those leaders said that being strategic is the most important leadership skill that you could have. But they were also asked the question whether they had enough time for strategic thinking and planning in their organizations, and 96% of them said that they lacked time to be able to actually do strategic thinking and planning in their organizations. So again, 68% of you said that there isn't enough time. So maybe in our field or the people on this call can note or can say that that you do feel like you have enough time, or you feel like you're able to build enough time in. But we also know that it's tough to find the time to actually engage in strategic planning and engage in sticking to our strategic plans. We know that that's been worse. The barriers that you shared at the beginning of this presentation, when we asked you to share what the barriers were to strategic or to transformation, you shared things like COVID-19 and staffing structures. All of those things have made our organizations have to, in a lot of ways, operate in the day-to-day. And sometimes that means that we put our strategic plans or our efforts for transformation on the back burner. But we also know that strategic planning, if we go to the next slide, is an essential component to successful transformation. Strategic planning provides our organizations with a roadmap throughout the transformation process. It assures that we agree to the goals and the direction of the transformation. So when we're talking about transformation with our strategic plans, we all know not only where we're going, but then the next part is it assures that we know what's needed or how we get there based on our strategic plan. And our strategic planning processes also help us to know what's needed for a transformation, what supports we need, what resources, what information, leadership skills, skills within our organizations, and things like that. Go to the next slide. So through our work at the Leadership Consortium, well, sometimes people who want to speed up the strategic planning process, and they'll ask for guides or step-by-step instructions or step-by-step toolkits or things like that that can inform their strategic efforts. Essentially, sometimes because we struggle to strategic plan in our organizations, or because we want to speed up that process, we are essentially looking for a secret sauce that can tell us how to transform. Unfortunately, what a secret sauce approach doesn't consider are the factors and the conditions that make your organization unique and that make your organization or that impact how your organization is actually going to transform. So ensuring that you take the time and that you commit to the to a strategic plan, on the other hand, means that your organization can take a more targeted approach that considers the internal and the external factors that inform where you are, where you begin, what your pace is throughout the transformation process, and then also what your approach is to transformation. Go to the next slide. Similarly, if you look for transformation tools, if you Google transformation planning, or strategic planning tools, or if you just do a search for strategic planning tools, you'll find that there are any number of steps and strategies that experts recommend. And so if you're in an organization that struggles to find the time for strategic planning, knowing the components of what a good strategic plan are can be really helpful for you, because even if you need to stretch out the process over a long amount of time, knowing what the components are can help you know where to start and what that first step is that might help. So this slide shows some key components of strategic planning. Again, there can be any number of steps, but those key components are really evaluating and assessing and knowing where your organization is starting, determining the goals and the vision that set where your organization is going, bringing in tools and determining benchmarks and timelines and that can inform the steps that your organization can take to get you from where you're starting to where you're going. And then perhaps most importantly, a key component of strategic planning is building in mechanisms, things like program reviews, evaluations, environmental scans, things that can help you to adapt your strategic plans over time. Sometimes what we found is that when people work so hard to develop their strategic plans, it's really tempting to treat them as something that's static. Something that's more like a paper roadmap that once it's printed, it stays the same, rather than a GPS system that as roads change, as terrain changes, as they realize they're driving people into ponds and things like that, those GPSs adapt and are ever adapting so that they're providing better roadmaps as people learn going forward. So what we know about great strategic planning is that it's a process that's flexible, and great strategic plans have steps to ensure that your organization is always learning and adapting. I think a great example that we've seen in our work pretty recently, we've had the opportunity to work with an organization that's at the National Leadership Consortium. We've had an opportunity to work with an organization that's transforming their day services from center-based services to focus on supporting people to be included in their communities. Like so many of our organizations, or so many of us on this call, how we support people to be included in their communities changed dramatically because of the pandemic, and that was definitely true for this organization as well. But because they had a flexible and a learning strategic plan, they were able to change their timelines. So as they were facing factors, again, like some of the barriers that you shared at the beginning of this call that forced them to slow down their strategic plan, they still had that plan and were able to return to it and to adjust their timeline. So they were still moving towards their goal, even though their pace was a little bit slower. They were able to adjust their steps to be more responsive to the organization as they faced staffing shortages and as they learned about different needs of people that they were supporting. And they were able to use what they learned about opportunities related to virtual supports to inform their plan going forward. So actually they were able to improve or better their strategic plan because they learned that there's a really effective way to support people virtually, or there are really effective ways to support people virtually. And so they were able to incorporate that into their strategic plan. I think what we've learned in working with them, or what we've really seen exemplified in working with them, is that their process has really been a strong example of how strategic planning can inform transformation and can be adaptive to inform better transformation as they're learning going forward. Next slide.
Okay, so Caitlin, you actually touched on some of these, so it's nice how the different sections kind of work together, but there's just a lot of reasons why data is important, and we really support data-informed decisions. And we talked about this earlier in terms of transparency, and I think that data can really help you kind of demonstrate the why you're doing something. Especially when you're trying to get that buy-in from your staff, which some of you identified was a barrier to transformation. But we know we can use data in our strategic planning. We can use it in terms of doing root cause analysis, and especially in terms of our abuse and neglect data or our critical incident data. A lot of times we see where maybe you take somebody to the doctor and you tell the doctor, you know, Mary Kay does that all the time. Well, this could have real implications on a person's life. You know, the doctor may wind up changing the person's medicine, or they may increase my dosage. Whereas if you kept hard, raw data, you might see that maybe there's just the perception that it's happening all the time. So it can help you make better decisions. The first one kind of makes me laugh, you know, improve people's lives. So it sounds kind of lofty in terms of data, but, you know, there's a lot of things that we know anecdotally. And if we have the data, maybe we can identify and respond to challenges before they become an actual crisis. You can make informed decisions. So when you have that data, you can tweak interventions or programs in real time. And you can do root cause analysis. I think I mentioned this. So for example, if you see that medication errors increase 1 month and you're not sure what's going on, if you have that data, maybe then you're able to dig deeper and look and see, oh, it's med refusals. Well, they seem to be at this one particular home. And then you dig deeper and find out, well, it's this one person. And then maybe you find out that they changed that person's medication. So maybe they don't like the side effects. So if you're not analyzing your data, you're not as well equipped to make those decisions in real time. And so there's more information on this on our website too. So I won't take any more time on here, but we do support data. So the next slide. I truly believe that good data can tell a story. And so this is just one piece of data from a research study that Carly Friedman did. And it shows that when you treat your employees with dignity, respect, and fairness, that challenging behaviors do decrease. And so obviously how you treat your staff ripples down and can impact the people that you support. And so if you go to the next slide. And this one is a study that just came out this week. And this just shows, these are two of our tools at CQL. You may not be familiar with the names, but our provider organization assessment, quality assessment is called the Basic Assurances. And then our individual assessment or discovery tool is called the Personal Outcome Measures, or the POM. And so what we have found is that the more systems and practices you have in place around those basic assurances, so around rights and dignity and respect and all of your staffing systems, the more systems and practices you have in place, the better the person's quality of life is. And so this is just, it makes sense that the better services you provide, the better lives that people will lead, but I haven't actually seen data that supports this. It's really just one of those things that we kind of know, but so we do have the data on this now. And this is really just to say, keep doing those efforts to transform your organization, because ultimately it will impact the people that you are providing supports to. And one last poll that we hope that even though we really only touched on some of these concepts, we hope that you'll, maybe it sparked your interest and maybe you'll look at some of them a little bit more and commit to doing something or expanding something that you do in these areas. And then while you're doing that, just to summarize kind of what we talked about, I know that we gave you a lot of information, but just in summary, open communication can be used to build trust and strengthen relationships, especially the transparency aspect of it. When you create an intentional culture that's tied to your vision and your values and your goals, it's going to lead to improved outcomes, especially during that transformation. A strengths-based approach can benefit your organization. And so we encourage you to become a strengths spotter, kind of a tongue twister there. And as Kristen mentioned and Caitlin discussed further, the strategic plan, it's really a roadmap, albeit a flexible one. There isn't a secret sauce. That's up to you to determine your secret sauce, but this can help guide your transformation process. And we hope that you are informing your decisions with the use of data. And just remember, no action without data and no data without action. So it looks like a lot of you are going to do some great things here. All right, so I'm going to hand it back over to Kristen.
Great, thank you. As we're coming to the end of our hour, we recognize that some of you may still have some questions. If you want to share those in the Q&A, you're welcome to, but please put your email and we will contact you with thoughts on the question or resources as well. Here is our contact information. If you want to copy that down and send us an email to get more information on anything we shared or clarification on anything that you might still have questions on. With that, thank you again for joining us for the fundamentals of transformation. We hope that you walked away with some ideas about how you can use some of these strategies to overcome those pitfalls that you might encounter during your transformation. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.